Red Ice, the Sino-Soviet border war. When titans collide. In March 1969, the world stood closer to a catastrophic war between two communist nuclear powers than anyone in Washington, District of Columbia, had ever anticipated. To the outside world, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China were viewed as parts of a monolithic ideological camp. They stood as a unified front against the United States in Asia, commanding massive standing armies and possessing the ultimate deterrent: nuclear weapons. However, the flashpoint was not a global capital, but the frozen surface of the Ussuri River. The prize was a desolate scrap of land known as Damansky Island, measuring less than 1 square kilometer. From a geographical perspective, it was negligible, but politically, it represented the battle for the soul and leadership of the entire socialist world. Within days, dozens of Soviet border guards would be dead, while Chinese losses, by various estimates, climbed into the hundreds. For the first time in history, the Soviet Army would deploy its secret weapon, the Grad multiple rocket launcher, against the regular troops of another communist state. As the Soviet Union considered a massive, potentially nuclear strike, the People's Republic of China prepared for the worst-case scenario. This local incident would eventually force Richard Nixon to fly to Beijing 3 years later, a strategic pivot that changed the Cold War forever. To understand how these allies ended up in each other's crosshairs, we must look back to the end of the 19th century and the death of Joseph Stalin. The Great Schism and the Cultural Revolution. The alliance began with high hopes. In October 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the birth of the People's Republic of China, with Moscow being the first to recognize the new state. A 30-year treaty of friendship and mutual assistance followed, leading to thousands of Soviet specialists flooding into China to build metallurgy plants, power stations, and train the People's Liberation Army. Soviet physicists even assisted in the birth of the Chinese nuclear program. During the Korean War, they acted as blood brothers against US-backed forces. The ideological divorce beneath the surface, a rivalry was festering. Mao did not see himself just as a leader of China, but as a center of the global revolution. Joseph Stalin, however, had no intention of sharing the ideological throne. After Stalin's death in 1953, the balance broke. At the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev delivered a speech condemning the cult of personality, which Beijing perceived as a direct strike against the very foundations of revolutionary legitimacy. Mao viewed Stalin as the ultimate model of a firm leader. Khrushchev's push for peaceful coexistence with the West was seen as a cowardly surrender. By 1960, the Soviet Union withdrew all specialists, and the joint projects collapsed. The Cultural Revolution and the border crisis. By 1966, China was engulfed in the Cultural Revolution. The Red Guards, Hunweiben, attacked not only their own party functionaries, but also foreign diplomats, including the siege of the Soviet embassy in Beijing. Anti-Soviet rhetoric became a mandatory part of internal mobilization. The 7,000-kilometer border became the stage for this drama. Under the 1860 Treaty of Peking, the border ran along the Chinese bank, giving every island to Russia. China argued these were unequal treaties, while a 1964 negotiation led by Pavel Zhirianov and Zheng Yongquan nearly moved the line to the center channel. The ousting of Khrushchev and the rise of Leonid Brezhnev caused the process to freeze. Violations jumped from 100 in 1960 to over 5,000 by 1962. Forbidden from firing, soldiers engaged in brawl wars, using sticks and poles to push each other off the ice. By 1969, The Ussuri River was a powder keg. The ambush of March 2nd. By late February 1969, the Chinese military was preparing for a lethal escalation. Intelligence noted increased activity and organized patrols near the island, which the Chinese called Zhenbao. On the night of March 1st into the 2nd, a group of approximately 77 Chinese soldiers, though some estimates suggest many more in reserve, crossed the frozen river. They wore white camouflage and wrapped their weapons in cloth to prevent any metallic glint. They dug into the western ridge of the island, creating hidden, well-fortified positions. The slaughter on the ice. At 10:20 a.m., observers at the Soviet Nizhny Mikhailovka post spotted a group of about 30 armed men. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Strelnikov scrambled 32 men in 2 trucks and a BTR-60 PB armored carrier. His orders were to issue a protest and physically push the intruders out without shooting. As the Soviet group neared the island, the Chinese gave a prearranged signal. An officer raised his hand. Instantly, a hail of automatic fire erupted from the hidden positions on the island and the flanks. Strelnikov's group was caught in a lethal crossfire, and most were killed in the first minutes. A secondary squad under Sergeant Vladimir Rabovich was caught in a separate ambush while trying to flank the ridge. Their bodies were later found with evidence of severe injuries. The rescue mission Senior Lieutenant Vitaly Bubenin at the neighboring Kulabyakany Sopki post rushed to help with 23 men and an armored carrier. Arriving at 11:30, he engaged in a fierce battle as the Chinese deployed mortars. Bubenin drove his vehicle across the ice to strike the Chinese reinforcements. Despite his vehicle being hit, he switched to another machine and continued the fight until the Chinese withdrew at approximately 1 p.m. The toll for the day was 31 dead Soviet soldiers. 15 March and the hail of fire. Following the battle, both nations began a massive buildup. The Soviets deployed the 135th Motorized Rifle Division, equipped with the top-secret BM-21 Grad rocket systems. These units had never been used in regular combat before. On 14 March, a confusing order led Soviet troops to temporarily withdraw from the island. But as soon as it was empty, Chinese troops seized the positions. By nightfall, a new order arrived: retake the island. Lieutenant Colonel Yevgeny Yanshin led 45 men back onto the island, digging into the frozen mud under the cover of 4 armored carriers. The tactical crisis. At 10 a.m. on 15 March, a massive Chinese artillery barrage began, utilizing between 30 and 60 guns and mortars. Hundreds of Chinese infantry, totaling several companies, charged the Soviet positions. Colonel Democrat Leonov, commander of the border detachment, led 4 advanced T-62 tanks onto the ice to break the siege. The T-62 was the pinnacle of Soviet technology, but the open river made it an easy target. Leonov's lead tank was disabled either by a mine or a grenade launcher, and Leonov was killed in the attempt to escape the vehicle. The Grad strike. The Soviet situation turned critical as the Chinese prepared to encircle the remaining troops. General Colonel Oleg Losik at the command post struggled to get clear orders from a hesitant Moscow. Finally, at approximately 5 p.m., the order was given to bypass the political delay and unleash the Grad. Several batteries unleashed a hail of rockets onto the Chinese shore, each unit firing 40 rockets in seconds. The firestorm pulverized the Chinese positions and depots. Soviet troops counterattacked and reclaimed the ground as the Chinese retreated. The Nuclear Brink and the American Hand. The silence that followed was the shadow of a mushroom cloud. A massive military buildup began along the entire 7,000-kilometer border. Soviet troop levels in the Far East grew several-fold, while Beijing mobilized its population for a total war against the threat from the north. Anti-Soviet propaganda reached its peak since the start of the Cultural Revolution. The Lop Nur threat. In the summer of 1969, the Soviet leadership seriously discussed a preemptive strike against China's nuclear testing facilities at Lop Nur. Soviet officials reached out to Western contacts to gauge the international reaction to such an attack. The American intelligence position. The Richard Nixon administration watched with calculated interest. U.S. intelligence reports indicated that a full-scale Soviet victory would destroy the strategic balance in Asia. In a bold move, the United States signaled to Moscow that they would not remain neutral if a nuclear strike occurred against China. This deterrent, along with the threat of international isolation, forced the Soviet leadership to reconsider. The airport diplomacy Mao Zedong used the crisis to consolidate internal power, purging more radical elements of the Cultural Revolution and sending them to the countryside to strengthen the military's influence. On 11 September 1969, Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin made a surprise stop at the Beijing airport to meet with Zhou Enlai. They agreed to a ceasefire, though the island effectively remained under Chinese control. The epilogue, a global shift. The battle for a tiny riverbank changed the world's gravity. The strategic realignment. Beijing concluded that Moscow was a more dangerous enemy than Washington. This led to the secret 1971 visit of Henry Kissinger and Nixon's historic 1972 trip to China. The two-front war. The Soviet Union was now trapped between NATO in the west and China in the east. This forced the massive construction of the Baikal-Amur mainline railway to ensure a supply line far from the vulnerable Chinese border. The social perception. Moscow portrayed the fallen guards as heroes. 5 were named heroes of the Soviet Union. Mass rallies in Soviet cities condemned the Chinese leadership, while in China, posters accused Moscow of socialist imperialism. The final transfer. In 1991, as the Soviet Union drew its final breaths, Damansky Island was officially ceded to China. Today, it remains a monument to a time when two brothers in arms almost ended the world over a square kilometer of mud and ice. The history of the Cold War was not a simple duel between two blocks. It was a complex game of survival where the periphery became the most dangerous point of all.